Ivo, did you have a chance to read that National Geographic article that I sent to you?
I did, and that was fascinating stuff. The whole concept of cooking versus non-cooking, because you sort of believe, I guess, what you hear through the media, which brings up an important point. That's one of the reasons we're here, in the Gait world, is to kind of be a BS filter. And
well, let's bring people up to speed here. Well, last week, one of the intro pieces that we did, kind of neuroscience pieces, we talked about the chapter 1 from Elaine Morgan's book called The Scars of Evolution. And we introduced her book and talked about some of the things that we were going to be talking about, the bipedalism and the cost of walking upright and some other issues. And it was really quite a fascinating book. It's one of my favorites. And we promised that we would take a little bit of time each week to talk about this stuff. So we pulled up an article that will be in the show notes from nationalgeographic.com. And the title of the article was What Makes Us Human? Cooking, says this study. And it was an article by, Nicholas Mott, M-O-T-T, from the National Geographic, and it was just from October 26th of this year, 2012. Really cool article. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I certainly did. It certainly fit right along the lines of the scars of evolution. And just to bring people up to speed, and we're going to put this in the show notes too, on May 1st, Ivo and I put together a real fun blog post article on upright bipedal walking and the stoned chimpanzee. And you'll have to read the article to understand where the stoned chimpanzee part comes from. But one of the things that I found really fascinating back then when we were putting this piece together is they're comparing apes and chimpanzees and humans. And they found that there was a difference between chimpanzees and apes. The chimpanzees put their hands down, like if you were to go into a downward dog type position in yoga or walk on your hands, you would put the palm of your hand down. Well, chimpanzees walk very similarly. They can lock the carpal bones in that fashion. But for those of you who have paid attention, an ape or gorillas will walk on their knuckles. So they will kind of go in what we call a neutral position, kind of like if you were doing knuckle push-ups, you'd be walking on the knuckles of your hands. And they said that the chimpanzees are much closer to humans, and the reason for that is they found that there was basically 5 parameters that were very similar pathologic gait problems that led to injuries similar in humans, and those things were a posteriorly tilted pelvis. And so think about a monkey walking on all hands or on all fours. A posteriorly tilted pelvis, a small weakened gluteal or muscle development in the glutes. They were quadriceps dominant, they lacked knee extension, and they lacked hip extension and gluteal development. Well, those things very much so can be seen in humans. And so the theory of our blog article, and you can go back and read it, was that we went upright to get away from some of these pathologic problems, and we're still in the developmental phase of trying to work through those. Posterior tilted pelvis, weakened glutes, quadriceps dominant, lack of knee extension, etc. And upright gait tends to give us the opportunity to get out of that. Coming full circle, I asked Ivo to read this article on what makes us human. And this article out of the National Geographic talked about cooking. What did you find most interesting about this whole thing on cooking? Because there's a lot of theories out there, and this article said that 1.8 million years ago there was a huge expansion in brain size, and they're attributing this article to being human. They kind of talked about caloric intake, right?
They did, and basically more caloric intake equals larger brain size, which is something we've kind of known for a while. I just didn't realize they made a statement, several paragraphs down in the article that I want to actually pull the original, because this came from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by a guy named Herculano Hosel, who actually had done the study, and that's what this is based on, where they said, heating our food unlocked nutrition. 100% of a cooked meal is metabolized by the body, whereas raw foods just yield 30 to 40% of their nutrients. So that was probably the most profound statement to me. I always thought, cooking makes foods, it enhances bioavailability. In other words, it softens the skin, it denatures certain proteins in there, makes things like when you cook wheat, it's much more bioavailable than when you're doing uncooked wheat and things like that. So for certain foods, you think that cooking's good, but I always kind of thought that, raw was probably the way to go. And a lot of that's probably some of the misinformation and some of the media hype lately about the paleo diet and things like that. There was a really interesting article in Scientific American, and this was a while ago. This is in '09, where they actually looked at vegetables, and they said, are raw vegetables healthier than cooked ones? And what they found, the answer is yes and no. Some raw vegetables, particularly things in the cabbage family, are generally can be a little bit better when they're raw. Broccoli especially is better when it's raw, but most foods are enhanced through boiling or steaming, not frying, but boiling or steaming. The only major breakdown was the loss of vitamin C. And vitamin C levels declined by about 10% in tomatoes cooked for a couple minutes, 30% when they're cooked for half an hour or longer. And vitamin C is just one of those unstable compounds, that can easily be changed through oxidation. So they were saying, and the gist of that article basically was that the trade-off was well worth it. And they mentioned the whole caloric intake back then as well. But it was just really fascinating delving back into some of this. And some foods, in particular tomatoes, will have an increased lycopene content. If you cook them for a little while, the lycopene content rose like a third over what it was in the raw form. Also, similar findings were found with carrots, spinach, mushrooms, asparagus, some cabbages, peppers, and other veggies. So it was a trade-off. Some things were actually better cooked. Some things were actually better raw. And the bottom line of the article was that you should eat both, not just cooked and raw. And if you're going to eat broccoli, eat it raw.
Well, and so the point of that then was that they're trying to extract as many nutrients out of the food as we could, right?
Exactly.
Right. And going back to this article, they said that, they kind of said, in order for a gorilla, for example, to get to 440 pounds, they said in this article, the thing would have to be eating 10 hours a day, because to get through all that fibrous food, of which you're only getting 30 to 40% nutrition bioavailability because of all the fibrous stuff and whatnot. Think about eating a raw sweet potato or a cooked one. It's going to take you forever to chew through that raw potato, but by cooking it, you get 30 or 40%. You get more bioavailability, 100%, whereas 30-40% of it is just so much. And there's a cost to chewing too. But they talked about this gorilla, in order to get to be 440 pounds, they'd have to eat for 10 hours a day. So as humans,
what's wrong with that?
But to become humans and to have a bigger brain, in the theory is, bigger brains allowed us to get upright, or that's one of the theories, and we'll talk about some others in a minute, was that we had to become more efficient with our food and cooking. So by cooking it, we were able to extract more nutrients. More nutrients meant we could spend less time eating, and less time eating allowed our brains to develop otherwise, to learn how to develop language, to work on weapons and tools, and work on other ways of trying to obtain food in a more easy manner, i.e. hunting. So I thought that was very interesting. There was a lot of stuff in this article. We could talk about this stuff forever, but there was some stuff that was just really, fascinating. I'm reminded in this article they talked about 1.8 million years ago, there was a brain size development, but we'll have it in the show notes. Another article at the University of Chicago, they found there was another massive expansion in brain size about 50,000 years ago. And we talk about it a little bit in that blog post from May 1st. But 50,000 years ago, there's another massive expansion in brain size. And the University of Chicago felt that perhaps this was related to some other issues, which we just mentioned: language development, religion, even things as interesting as burial. As we became more developed, we started having religious ceremonies for burials and stuff like that. But carrying the children, it was more efficient to carry a child with the upper limbs and to use the lower limb. But then you got to think about persistence hunting, weapons creation, tools, etc. Think about monkeys. As far as they get, they might stick a twig down an ant hole, and that's as far as they get with tools. But as humans, perhaps because of this cooking issue, we were able to spend more time, honing our skills, developing our brain size, and developing the ability to use tools, which then again developed more brain size. So We talked about that a little bit in the blog article, but again, another brain size expansion around 50,000 years ago, and they've proven that, but it certainly makes you wonder why.
I think you got a larger part of that expansion than I did.
Well, in Elaine's book, and we'll save this for a little bit next time because we're already 10 minutes into this, is she talked about her own reasons for this, and think about looking over the grasslands, being able to see above the grasslands on 2 feet where you might see some animals grazing and you could sneak up on them then, as opposed to being on all fours. You're part of the habitat below the line of grain and food and wheat and whatnot. So it gave us another perspective of vision as well. So, and I know you like talking about the extensors and whatnot. What are your thoughts on that vision and the primitive brain, and do you have any thoughts on that stuff as being part of the evolutionary chain?
Yeah, but not as much with bipedalism. If you and I were standing upright, we look at the 3 curves in the spine. Obviously, we're prone to increased flexor activity, but we're going to get a certain amount of extensor tone that's going to occur as a result of that. If you think about just the cervical spine, where we have the highest density of mechanoreceptors and muscles, particularly the upper cervical spine, if you go down on all fours and you extend your head, you're going to get way more mechanoreceptor afferentation or activation than you are standing upright, because you have to extend the head that much more when we're on all fours, because we're designed to be largely bipeds,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I don't know.
They also, there was some dialogue on energy conservation, and that becoming upright allowed us to become more efficient in our energy. The first thing I think of when I mention that is the persistent hunting, whereas we were much more effective in developing endurance and utilization of energy being bipedal running than in quadruped. You think of all the quadruped animals and their problems with endurance and whatnot. So, so that's another perspective. There's a lot of them. Evolution, whether or not that's something you believe in or not, but it's kind of hard to overlook some of the facts.